Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargav again. Welcome to Tidbits on Business and Finance with me. The state of the government finances this year has been tough. Government finances are stretched and stressed. And this is despite the fact that in the current financial year, there has been a revival of the Indian economy. Growth rate has been better, and when the economy grows better and faster, so do the revenue collections of the government, and the stress on the government finances should be lower. But that is not what it is. The year began with Mr. Arun Jaitley promising in his budget that the fiscal deficit for the year will not cross 3.3% of the GDP. What does that mean in rupee terms? It means that the excess of the government expenditure over its receipts will not exceed 6.25 lakh crores. In other words, the government would be spending beyond its pocket to the tune of 6.25 lakh crores. But as the year progressed, it was very clear that the government is not going to be able to meet its fiscal deficit target as promised. We are in an election year. Populist spending for electoral gains is a done thing. And more than that, the government needs to urgently recapitalize the bankrupt public sector banks. As we recently saw that in the winter session, Mr. Jaitley had taken an additional permission to infuse an additional 41,000 crores into banks on an urgent basis. So with this kind of a situation, it is very clear that the government is unlikely to meet its promised fiscal deficit target, and its expenditure will be much more than what was promised. Mr. Jaitley, however, thinks otherwise, and he remains very committed that the government will not exceed its set target of 3.3%. The situation is tough. The government is walking a tightrope, and its desperation shows. This desperation was evident in the public slugfest that took place with the Reserve Bank, leading to the abrupt resignation of the then Reserve Bank Governor Dr. Urjit Patel. The government may deny that the slugfest, one of the reasons for it was the government is eyeing the reserves of the Reserve Bank of India to meet its fiscal deficit. The government denied it. The Reserve Bank Governor resigned, and we now have a more amenable Governor of the RBI. The RBI has already indicated that by March 2019, it intends to give an interim dividend to the government, which could be to the range of 40,000 crores. So, the government has been eyeing money wherever it can be available. Reserve Bank is one. The government has also been eyeing money of funds like the National Savings, Small Savings Funds. LIC has been a favorite checkbook of the government of India. Whenever something is in trouble, LIC steps in. The government's disinvestment program has been failing, and it cannot afford for the disinvestment program to be failing. It has thus been resorting to the ingenious measure of ensuring that one PSU is bought by another from the government. This is what happened in the case of Dredging Corporation of India, where all the ports together bought the Dredging Corporation from the government of India, thus giving money to the government in the process. The government has also been sending messages that all those public sector units which are profit making need to be giving handsome interim dividends to the government. So the desperation, the tightrope walking of the government is pretty evident, and it has been looking out for resources, it has been looking out for revenues. The real problem lies in the fact that the tax collections of the government this year have not been up to the mark. It was always known that the GST collections are not expected to meet their target, the target being a collection of 1 lakh crore a year. For the third successive month, the government has been unable to meet this collection target, and it is expected that there will be a deficit, a shortfall of at least 70,000 crores in GST collections this year as against the budgeted figure, and Mr. Jaitley somehow needs to provide for it. While the GST collections have been suffering, it has now been noticed that a similar situation is emerging in the case of direct tax collections, which is income tax. As late as September 2018, the finance minister had expressed confidence that the government will exceed its direct tax collection target of 11.5 lakh crores for this year. But that doesn't seem to be happening. The CBDT chairman, in his message to his officers, has insisted on recovery harsh recovery of demands to be able to meet the target, and despite that, the targets look to be unlikely to be met. And the reason is very clear. Much as the economy has been on an upswing, the fact still remains is corporate profits have slowed down. Even the Indian economy in the second half of this year is expected to see a kind of a slowdown, and that will impact the tax collections. So the real problem of the government lies with the fact that tax collections have not been up to the mark. What are the options available for Mr. Jaitley to meet his fiscal deficit target? The obvious statement is to say, prune your expenditure, don't spend as much as you do. But there are limitations to the government to do that. It cannot not pay salaries. Interest has to be paid. So even though there is some kind of a slowdown seen in some social sector ministries, the fact remains is there are limitations on that. And what will suffer in the process is infrastructure expenditure, capital expenditure, because that can be easily postponed, and that is not good for the country. It impairs, it hinders the progress, the momentum of growth of the country. That looks to be likely. But what looks to be more likely to us is the fact that some kind of window dressing is going to be undertaken to dress up the fiscal deficit figure and say that the target was met. And how does that get done? It gets done by resorting to what are called off-budget transactions. Instead of the government borrowing, a PSU would borrow and incur an expenditure. Instead of the government spending, a PSU would spend it and not come on the books of the government. The government will incur expenses and not pay them. The government will postpone subsidy payments. The government will postpone payment to vendors. In other words, the government will ensure that it has managed to window dress its book and then finally report that we managed to restrict the fiscal deficit to 3.3%. The CAG in its recent report has reported that something like this, in terms of window dressing the fiscal deficit figure, was actually done by the government in its finances for the financial year 2017, just the last year, and it was to the tune of almost 55-60,000 crores. There's no reason that the government will not resort to this kind of window dressing of the fiscal deficit figure by resorting to off the budget transactions. The government also window dresses, the corporates also window dress, the banks also window dress. It doesn't seem to be a new practice. This is Akhilesh Bhargav signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.